So after making a game design document, I'd say the next step is gathering your team. Who's going to help you build this game? Because it's a ton of work to build a game. And it's also interdisciplinary. And some of those disciplines aren't really related to each other. Like a programmer is not usually a designer.
Right, in terms of like creating art assets.
Yeah, and a designer, like an illustrator, is not the same as a game designer who works in like Excel to balance your game. And then, music composition, all these different things. It's hard to gather a team of people. And you remember we had a game design group.
Yes.
And that group was brought together by the idea of, let's build a game.
That was a little bit like the Game Ideas subreddit, that group.
Yeah, and I don't think that paradigm works. You can't get people together and say, let's build a game. In my experience, you need a game idea. You almost need your whole design document done. And then you approach people and you show them. And they either get on board or they don't. And that's what seems to work. It
felt like in that, the subreddit works, I think, in the same way that our WeChat group works, which is that people pitch ideas which sound cool, and there's a constant stream of those. But steps beyond that have to be taken by individual actors, not by the group.
So my team isn't very big, and 95% of it is me. But I did get a musical composer, Eric, our friend, and he wrote just an awesome soundtrack. In fact, the story of getting Eric on board is pretty cool because I was developing the game at Berlin House, which is a coffee shop we hang out at, and Eric was there producing music or something. We just got to talking. I didn't know him. And he said, what are you doing? I told him about the game. I told him I needed music. And then, we both got back to work. And like 20 minutes later, he said, come over here. And he put his headphones on me. He's like, how about this for your game? And he had already written like 1 or 2 songs for the game. I was like,
oh, it's brilliant.
Wow, this is pretty cool.
Yeah, I'll tell you also, I've been involved in the music scene here in Chengdu for well over a decade. I know probably as many music producers here as any expat does. I would say Eric is definitely on the short list of the best people you could collaborate with on this particular project.
Yeah, well, a week later, he came back with the whole soundtrack. I had briefly gone over kind of like, yeah, maybe we could work together. And then he comes back and he's already done the whole soundtrack for the game, and it was great. And I think the soundtrack adds a lot to the game. I've had a number of the beta testers comment that they really enjoy the soundtrack. So Eric,
that's great. And he did sound effects as well?
He helped with some of the kind of UI sound effects. So all the UI stuff, the beeps and boops, they're all in key with the music, which is cool. And then the second thing I needed was an illustrator. So my girlfriend, she wanted to learn like Photoshop and stuff. So she illustrated most of not the UI, but like the kind of airplanes and ships. I guess you could call it the character art of the game.
Sure.
And she did it all on an iPad with a little stylus.
That's kind of neat. Unconventional. Most people would use like a Wacom tablet, but...
Well, she was just beginning, and we didn't have any of that stuff. So she would draw it on an iPad, and then I would load it up into Photoshop and just fix it up. And that was my team. It was me, a music composer, and an illustrator.
Great. Well, those are the bare bones, I guess. I mean, you could have done those other things yourself. It just would have taken you more time.
We would be doing this podcast probably 2 years from now if I had to do all that other stuff.
Maybe you're right. And then you had a music producer just sort of serendipitously make an entire soundtrack for you in 1 week. So that's a good outcome there. But I would be curious to hear, you spent 2,000 hours working on this. What were the parts which you didn't see coming, which were real big challenges? I mean, certainly you must have spent a lot of that time, like a disproportionate amount of that time on particular challenges, which were really time consuming or really difficult. What were those? Yeah,
well, obviously programming is one of the big ones. I had some experience programming, but programming a game is just a whole nother level. And tools like Game Maker, and also tools like, I forget what, Unity has this drag and drop tool that you're supposed to not need to code. But at the end of the day, you need to learn how to code if you're going to make a full game.
Yep.
So learning all of the basics of programming, things like variables and variable scope, learning all your conditional statements, learning the basics of object-oriented programming. In a game is filled with objects. And each object has its own rules that governs how it interacts with other objects. and it's emergent. You don't know what's going to happen in a game. Unlike other software where the pathways are fixed, and it might be easy for a software developer to just write out the whole program. In a game, you have to write a series of objects and teach them how to interact with each other, and then kind of like let your hands go and watch and make sure they interact with each other. So learning programming was a big step.
What is the language of GameMaker?
The GameMaker uses something called GML, GameMaker language. It looks a lot like C. It's like C with forgiveness.
Okay.
It's a forgiving form of C. Like if you forget the semicolon, your game won't crash.
Oh, wow. That is a big difference.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It's nice for somebody getting started.
A lot of really notable games have been made with GameMaker as well. I think we mentioned this previously on a podcast, but I believe Hotline Miami, there's a list of notable games which have been global bestsellers.
Do you have any favorites? GameMaker games?
Well, Hotline Miami is the first one which comes to mind. That's one of my favorite independent games of all time.
Hyper Light Drifter, pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
Art-wise.
Pretty cool. Art-wise, exactly. Art-wise seems to be what it excels at. But anyway, the point is that GameMaker is pretty accessible. It's known for being a pretty easy tool to get into, relatively speaking, compared to Unity or a lot of these more advanced, complicated, difficult platforms. But with that said, GameMaker has also been used to make some truly global blockbuster games, which people have built real businesses around.
Yeah, I'm still trying to think. Cook Serve Delicious.
Oh, yeah, that's a fun one.
GameMaker game.
We played that at CGF event.
There's a number of them. There's the GameMaker Showcase. If anybody's interested, just on Yo-Yo Games, they have the GameMaker Showcase, and they've got all the games listed. They have some pretty cool games.
Yo-Yo Games is the creator of GameMaker.
Right.
They do a lot of great sales on Steam and other places. I think I even have GameMaker in my Steam library just because it was so inexpensive at some Steam sale. So it's great that it's so accessible.
Yeah, and I bought it on Steam, and for one, it tracks my hours, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I was wondering how you got the 2,000 hour figure. It's through Steam.
Right, I know exactly how many hours I spent, which is pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
Another thing, there's what do you call it there's achievements?
Yeah.
So I every once in a while you'll just get an achievement in GameMaker, and sometimes it's hilarious. Like your game is crashing and you're beating your head on the keyboard. You're so mad, and then you get the achievement. Ding! 100 crashes.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's a really cool tongue-in-cheek, fun little part to add. I think Steam is a great distribution platform. I mean, aside from being the best platform for PC games by a light year, it's also a great model for software distribution in general. If Steam were to branch out into, productivity applications like GameMaker, I think that would be really cool. Achievements are pretty neat to add. Adding one simple way to update and install apps is great. So it's good that you got GameMaker through Steam. I know you can get it off of Steam also.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to caution though is if you get it through Steam, because I had to deal with this, Steam only lets you run one thing at a time. So you can't run GameMaker and then on your other computer be playing Rust,
right,
which was something I wanted to do. It wouldn't let me do that.
Yeah, good point.
So some of the things I had to learn, juicing. I didn't know what juicing was, but as it turns out, computer programs are not naturally stimulating. They kind of, even if you program something that looks like a game, when you play it, it feels like a calculator. You have to do what in the indie game community developers have called juicing to make your game stimulating to the player. So I'll give you some examples, and when I say them, you'll probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Screen shake. Screen shake makes whatever action you did feel big, like you moved your whole computer. Chroma shift. You familiar with that? Where they take
color shifting?
They take the RGB of a sprite and they just kind of
Sure.
move to the side.
Yep, it's like a visual color effect.
Particle effects are great. Particle effects just means you produce like hundreds of these little maybe sparks or flames, or in my game when you blow up a ship, all the little pieces of metal just fly out.
Right.
Things like that. Another one is using math and programming for movement. So that sounds a little weird, but if you make a game where you press left and you move left, and then you stop pressing left and you just stop, that's going to feel very bland. So you have to actually go in and write some equations for acceleration and deceleration, and then like a little bit of a slide. And you add all these things that make your game feel more like a game and less like a computer program.
Sure.
When it comes to sound, let's say you have a footstep sound. So you're walking around and it's going it's pretty annoying. So you can do things like pitch variation. So every footstep is just a little bit different than the one before it. And it's just anything you can do to make your game just a little bit more stimulating. And it's almost separate from game design. These are just things that kind of like hack the human primate brain and make them say, I'm having fun right now.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I never heard of it described as juicing before. That's cool.
Yeah, I think, what is it? Like Candy Crush is a classic example of like what people are playing a puzzle game, but it's so stimulating. There's like these bright colors and they look like food and they burst and they go like, pew.
Yeah. All the visual effects, all the subtle effects really add up a lot to make the game feel dynamic and lifelike.
So that stuff is really important. And in my game, one thing I juiced the crap out of whenever you beat the other player, there's this explosion. But it's not just an explosion. Like the camera zooms in and the whole screen's shaking and it's exploding and there's stuff flying everywhere. And then there's a big flash and then it says victory. And that makes the player feel good. The player does that 1 or 2 times, and then they kind of get hooked. Like every level, they're like, oh, I want to get to that explosion.
No kidding. That's cool. Was that a difficult part to add? I mean, aside from the mechanics of you're guiding the ship, you're guiding it towards the aircraft carrier, you're avoiding gunfire, things like that. After you get past those steps, then adding these sort of things, how much of that is time-consuming, difficult work, or is it pretty trivial and easy once you get these concepts down?
I say it takes a lot of time because you need it to look good and feel good, For example, in my game, you have these ships and they shoot. And every time they shoot the gun and they hit the other ship, there's a little explosion. But it felt flat. So I had to make it so whenever you hit the other ship, the ship wobbles a little bit. And then it felt better. But then there's big ships and little ships. And if the big ship wobbles just as much as the little ship, then it feels weird. So you have to go in and you have to tweak. And you say, all right, the big ship wobbles less. But what if 2 gunshots hit? Then you have to incorporate 2 wobbles. So there's all these little things that you wouldn't think about, but they ultimately affect the feeling that the player gets. And that big explosion that I talked about earlier, I spent at least 2 weeks on that, making that look cool and feel good.
Thanks for listening. Next week, we'll cover Part 3, releasing your game to beta testers and the world.